Hello and welcome to the first episode of my Sound Design Here Create video series. This is Project 1, Sound for a Sculpture, Episode 1, Ideas. So let me recap what this series is about. This series is about sound design, but it's not about sound design for a particular purpose or on a particular synthesizer. It's about sound design in general, the process as a whole. The way we're going to cover the process as a whole is by making a set of mini-series, each built around a project. Now the project is going to be a piece of media and a corresponding prompt, which is going to guide us towards a sound design heavy piece of audio. Now that might be music and that might be not music, depending on the prompt. So let's look at the first prompt and let's discuss what we're going to do with it. So the prompt has two parts here. The media part is this image of a sculpture that I made. The prompt that goes with it is this. Here is a sculpture. Create the audio that would accompany it as part of an art installation. So, what are we going to do today? Well, you may notice there's a synthesizer in front of me, the Sonicware Liven 8-bit Warps. Though I have a synthesizer, this episode is not really about sound design. This episode is about generating ideas that we will then use as part of a sound design process. So this synthesizer is more of a scratch pad at this point to test out the ideas that we have. Once we have the ideas in place, in the next 1, 2, 3 episodes, we're going to come back with other pieces of hardware, with software, and we're going to work out the actual fine-tuned audio and go all the way from these ideas that we generate today to a finished piece of audio. So with that out of the way, what do I think of when I think of an art installation? Well, I imagine, looking at the image, this is a large space, and this sculpture is probably alone in this relatively large room. So the audio that we create is supposed to enhance the experience of viewing this sculpture. In other words, it is an ambience that is composed for the room, as opposed to a piece of audio composed for a particular listener to listen to. Now, there are a few things that I would do if I was actually putting this in an art installation, and I'm going to tell you how I'm not going to do those and why I'm not going to do those, and how I'm going to try and compensate for that to some extent. So, firstly, when someone moves through the space, ideally I would like the audio that they hear to vary depending on the path they take through. What I'm going to do is create a piece of stereo audio, and I'm going to probably apply some spatial effects to give it a degree of breadth. But that doesn't mean that that's what I would do in the real case. Specifically in the real case, rather than stereo audio, I would have more speakers. And those speakers would interact with the space and they would generate a field of sound. As a clear example of this, when you have a pair of speakers and stereo audio, if you walk through that space, there is basically one line on which you experience the stereo audio. And if you move off of that line, you're effectively panning the sound. And if you rotate, again, you're panning the sound. In contrast, when you have at least 4 channels, that's quadraphonic sound, you define a rectangular space in which a field of sound is defined. And depending on your orientation and position within that field, your experience of the audio would be different. So if I were making an art installation, I would probably look to put 10 speakers maybe around the space. And each of those speakers would be playing something different. And ideally, that would mean that as someone walked through, if they spent a lot of time at the entrance, their experience would be different to if they went straight up to the sculpture or if they circled around the sculpture. So that's one of the things that I would like to do differently, but I won't be able to for time and technical constraints of YouTube. Secondly, I want to make a relatively short piece of audio so as this does not become a tremendously long and dull video. So I'm going to make it about 1.5 minutes long. In practice, I would like the audio in an art installation to be long enough that it doesn't repeat in the amount of time that a viewer spends at this particular exhibit. So my expectation would be that they might spend 15 minutes. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'd need to make 15 minutes of audio in a real installation. That is because if I had 10 speakers, each one of them could be playing a different audio snippet of different lengths. One could be 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 7 minutes, 8 minutes, and they would therefore go out of phase with one another. So this would mean that the overall experience didn't have an obvious repetition except over the course of many hours, which a human probably wouldn't perceive. So I think that is an important element of what we're doing here. But what I'm going to do with both of those factors is I'm going to try and point out things that I would do in a real installation that I'm not doing in these sound design videos to provide those sort of features. So now how do we translate the prompt into sound? Well, I think one of the ways that I can think of doing that, I want the sound to be in harmony with the space, and therefore I'm going to use the space to guide the audio creation. And this is where I'm going to go to this synthesizer. Looking at the space, I can think of 4 elements that matter to me. One of them is the room and the darkness around. Another one is the floor itself. Another is the base of the sculpture. And finally, the sculpture proper. So let's start thinking about the sculpture. When I was modeling it, I was just thinking something ellipsoid or egg-shaped with ridges with sort of varying angles as we go along. But when I came to create a material, it reminded me of a shell, something like a mother of pearl. So I think I'm going to take that aspect, the sort of sea nautical aspect, and use that as inspiration here. So the sound I'm going to use then to represent the darkness in the room is going to be the sound of waves. But clearly this sculpture is not a natural sculpture, it is an artificial construct. So rather than going for field recordings, I think what I would do is make some synthesized wave sounds. Now, this synthesizer doesn't actually have a noise source on board. So what I've had to do is fine-tune the FM such that it sounds kind of noisy, and then I'm going to use the filter. So I've already made a sequence which is just all 6 notes chromatically played on top of each other so as it sounds very noisy, and I'm going to use the filter to adjust it. See here, I can open the filter and close the filter. Not exactly the sound that I wanted, but this is the sound I'm going to go for. This is a monotimbral sequencer. So what I'm using is the audio looper that it has to record this audio. So we're on the final stretch. I'm going to set it to record. So it's not recording anything of the external audio that's coming in. It's just recording from the sequencer. So 3/4 of the way through. Okay, so there's a loop created. Clear the pattern. So now this is an audio loop that we're listening to, and now we're going to discuss the next of the elements that we might be interested in. I'm going to also clear the patch that's in here. The next element is the floor. Now the floor, referring to that nautical theme, it reminds me a bit of the sea. It's dark, I can imagine it being deep water, but it's also completely flat. So again, something synthetic about it. Since we have waves, my first thought was to do something like a dripping or trickling water sound. This should be something, if you're familiar with the genre lowercase, It should be something along those lines, something really in the background, maybe reminds you of what people call ASMR nowadays. I think something quiet. For now, on this synthesizer, I'm just going to make a little drip sound, but I think for the real version, I'm going to be sampling something here. So let's listen to what we've got, the sound. So I think then let's shake the envelope first. Very short attack. Let's set the release. Okay, let's set the decay a bit longer than that, and the sustain down to 0. So now I'm going to adjust the waveform. Okay, so that's okay. So now I'm going to probably close the filter a bit. So it's on the low pass filter. Okay, I think that works. So now I'm going to add a little delay to it. So let's... Okay, with the speed of that delay, I was expecting not to be, but... So let's go to the looper, and let's tell it to start recording when it comes round. Okay, so now we have 2 audio loops playing. So I think the latter of those loops, what I would do is animate them in stereo. In practice, I didn't record any of that type of movement, so for now it's just centered. The next element that I would add is representative of the bass. Now, I mentioned that the sculpture looks like it could be shell, and I was imagining putting this on a bass and the bass being made of stone or something like that, and I imagined this scraping sound that it would make. Now, I'm not really going to be able to synthesize that adequately, so rather than try, what I wanted to do was give you a feel for that type of sound. You may have noticed these cups and thought, oh, he's putting ornaments on his desk now. No, they're not ornaments, they're sound design tools. In order for you to hear them, I'm going to turn off my noise suppression for a moment and give you a feel for the sound that I'm thinking of. This is probably going to be way too loud, but listen to the timbre. My mics are overhead in case you're wondering. So hopefully you can hear that sort of grinding, rough sound that I have going on there. So I didn't record that, but that's a timbre that we should keep in mind. The final element that I've been thinking of is the sound of the sculpture itself. And what I was inspired by are these sort of different gradients along the surface of the sculpture. So I was imagining another sound that's slower and it's enveloped, reflecting that shape. So let's try and bring a sound together here. So let's get a timbre we like first. It's nice, sort of triangle. Okay, that's nice and simple. So let's get an attack first. set that to 70, and I'm going to set release correspondingly, and decay correspondingly, and no sustain. So that's the sound, but rather than just use the sound like that, what I'm going to do is manually animate it to some degree. I feel like that could do with a little something else, so maybe I'll add a chorus and see how that sounds. Oops, let's open the filter. Okay, I think I quite like that. And then also I think this is crying out for a bit of reverb, so let's... Now some of this reverb sound I think would actually come from the room, but since we're not in a room, I'm not going to add it, but I'm going to now manually play in some of this, and I think this will be the last part. So go to the looper, next part. Okay, so here we are. We have these basic sounds. Maybe I'll do some quick EQ just to see. Okay, so that, along with that sort of grinding sound, I think represents what I think of as the space. At the moment, I think the audio is a bit imbalanced. So when we come to designing these, I'm going to be thinking about how I place them spatially, how I place them spectrally so they don't clash, and how I avoid them becoming too strong and too forward. But for now, I think this works. So what are we going to do in the next episode? Well, the sounds that I've made here are probably not the sounds that I'm actually going to be using in the finished piece, but they are going to be the foundation of the shape of what we're going to do. So next episode, expect different techniques. Expect me probably to have taken some actual recordings here, maybe gone and recorded some water dripping, and then we'll get to sound designing and we'll really refine these sounds, and maybe that'll be one episode, maybe two, and then finally we'll bring it all together into a completed piece of audio. I hope that sounds appealing to you, and I hope you enjoyed watching today. But most importantly, I'd like to say thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.